Hi, 72 Daystar, and I'm out in the countryside. And I decided to see if I could, just turn on the camera and see if a video happened. What's been on my mind is still begging the question. This is a very commonly misunderstood expression. In fact, it's so misunderstood that it's actually being recognized by some more liberal lexicographers as a legitimate use. That is to say, beg the question could mean that it makes you want to ask. And so I would say, if we're in a discussion and there's some apparent gap, it might make you want to ask a question. Well, what feels, what's that about? But that's not the original meaning. It's just a common misuse that became so common that it's actually, as far as I can see, it's actually used in the mistaken way more often than it is used correctly. That's story one. Even by people with PhDs. I mean, Michael Shermer gives a talk where he makes some really good points, but I just can't help being distracted by his misuse of the "it begs the question" expression. Begging the question comes from logic, and it's where you assume your conclusion in your premise. So, for example, if I said, how can you have, if you have a creation, then you must have a creator. Here's a creation, therefore there's a creator. This is very much what intelligent design is about. What they're just calling specified complexity or irreducible complexity already implies that there's an intelligent agent out there. That's your conclusion. If your conclusion is in your premises, then what you're doing is begging the question, and you have an invalid argument. So I would say that the intelligent design argument is invalid for that reason. At least if you take this approach, that it's complex, therefore it must have been designed. It's complex in a certain way that we can only imagine. I mean, that's an appeal to ignorance. If you can only imagine that it requires some intelligent agent, well, we don't know the limits of what biochemistry and evolution can construct. And the most troubling and damning thing that occurs to me on this problem is that there are very complex biological systems that have been explained in a stepwise fashion using biochemistry, and then scientists went out in the field and said, well, if that's true, then we should find this. And they went out and they found that. I'm not a biochemist, so I don't want to mangle this, but there was an aspect of our physiology, the biochemistry of our physiology, that said, okay, we have this protein, but how could we get that protein? Because there weren't some antecedent proteins available to construct that. Well, they said, well, perhaps there were at an earlier stage of our development or an earlier stage of our evolution. And so they said, well, then it still could be in our genome. So they went and they found what is now a mutated gene that is turned off. It's no longer creating proteins, but they could see that it would have created this protein that was needed in order to synthesize the more complex protein. So that's just one terribly explained example that shows us if we have a viable explanatory mechanism, just because it doesn't explain everything. And that aside, of course it doesn't explain everything. Our understanding of material creation is always going to fall a little short of it. The understanding of the complex phenomenon is always going to be short of the complex phenomenon. That's a logical necessity, right? So we can't use those gaps. We can't use those rationally, legitimately, as support for this other premise. That's the point I'd like to make. I've tried, you know, the smartest Christian interlocutor I know, he apparently doesn't know much more than I do about biochemistry, but he just cannot imagine that, he won't even concede that we have explained really complex systems. So in that context, it really seems irrational and illegitimate to say, look, this is really complex and we don't have an explanation, therefore that's evidence for my premise. That's an intelligent agent. And I think that's illegitimate on both the grounds that it's begging the question, you're assuming your conclusion in your premises, and it's an appeal to ignorance in that just because we have a viable mechanism that has explained many features of material reality, including, you know, our biochemistry, and just because it doesn't explain this, that is no good, no rational reason to say, okay, well then we need some unknown, unsupported, intelligent agent to explain this. It's a false explanation. But so far, really quite disappointed. No one really is, you know, this textbook fallacies that really people should be beyond and be able to see like that, especially if you happen to have an advanced degree in philosophy. Anyways, thoughts for the evening. 72 Days Star, out.